Hello and welcome to the Occult book review. It's been a while since I've done a review. I've been focusing more on my folklore research at Circle Stories, which I'll link to at the end of this video. This week though I wanted to talk about Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, 700 to 1100 by Max Dashu. It's a book I've had for a while, and as you can see by how many kind of pages I've turned, it's a book I've been going over quite a bit. It's probably one of the most important books I've read personally when it comes to Irish traditional indigenous shamanism, which has been so oppressed here in Ireland that most people I know don't even know it even existed. But this is a fantastic book which gives an insight into how it was oppressed, why it was oppressed, and also the archetypes that go back a lot further, sometimes into the Paleolithic, believe it or not. And it also gives a good description of a potential use for our megalithic tombs, which I don't believe are tombs at all, but I'll go more into that as I go on. So really, the book is part of an ongoing series. This is the first one, and it begins with, I suppose, the idea of spinning and the past, present and future. You may know this concept from the Norns. You may not know that there are also kind of traditions like this in Ireland, and a good resource is at ducas.ie, where you can find old spinning songs and poems that women used to sing when they would be at the spinning wheel. A lot of them would be to do with fairies, would be to do with magic, would be to do with going out at night, well weirding, which is another kind of area that comes up in this book. In fact, there's so much in this book that it's going to be very hard to even talk about it properly and to do it any kind of justice. So the only way I really can talk about it is to talk about it from an Irish perspective and my own perspective. So in that context, we learn about the kind of the takeover of old pagan traditions, matriarchal traditions. And I found that myself when I was working in a museum. I spent a year researching a particular saint, Saint Bridget, who you might know. And I was looking into the parallels between Saint Bridget, the pagan Bridget, and another saint you may not know called Saint Lazarian. And sometimes that name is changed to Molais, sometimes it's changed to Lazaire. But he was known as a male saint who changed the date of Easter, but really he came from a pagan triple goddess called Lazaire, Lazarian, and she was also associated with the vernal equinox at Easter and the changing date there. So it was a kind of a big revelation to me, and the reason why they weren't considered the same deity at the time was because they were separated by counties. But as I showed in my research, like, counties have nothing to do with it. That was a much later division. So that was something that I found echoed in this book, the depth of research that Dashu has to show this Christian takeover of pagan deities. And you may remember that a couple of months ago I reviewed this recent book called The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie, which I would also recommend to go along with this one. So, as I mentioned, we have a huge amount of megalithic monuments here in Ireland, and for, I suppose, up until now, and I suppose it's still the case, they're not really associated as women's places. But I think there's good evidence in this book and in an ongoing podcast series that Max Dashu appears on, which I'll link to again at the end of this book review, that there's a womb association with places like Newgrange, Knowth, and for me, Baltinglass, which is a place I talk about quite a bit on my Circle Stories page. And I also talk about the idea of stone circles having some women's shamanic function, and I'll link again to an article I've written about that before. The idea of the Mora Encantada, for example, who were women who were known to bring new life and to spin the sun. And to me, these ideas tie into a lot of the themes that Dashu speaks about in this book, or that she writes about. Spinning comes up an awful lot. Spinning is to do it bringing something into existence, knowing its fate, and the fates of course are maybe the kind of oldest archetype of these three women, and the triple deity is something again that comes up an awful lot in this book. Now, for me, the idea of a women's shamanistic tradition is something that I see evidence of here in Ireland anyway, but sometimes these lineages seem to have been incorporated into mythology, Irish mythology, which was written by Christian monks, don't forget. So that's something that's really important to always remember when you're looking at what they're saying about Ireland and the way Ireland was. And the women, the shaman women, seem to have been pushed into these archetypes which appear as certain goddesses, but to me there's more than that. It's not just a one-off supernatural deity here. What I think is happening is that there's a repression of a much more widespread tradition that everyone at the time knew about. Now, if you want to know a bit more about this, you can look up a letter by Pope Gregory, which was written Pope Gregory I, which was written around 500 AD, and in it he's speaking to his bishops in the British Isles in particular, but I'm sure there was a letter that went around all of Europe. And what he's saying is we need to stop destroying the pagan temples. We need to stop killing the pagans. What we need to do instead is to take over their temples, to replace their gods with our God, to replace their deities with our saints. And in that way we can have a more sort of a creeping takeover, and by doing so we will be able to establish a longer tradition rather than all of the bloodshed which is going on now. And it makes you wonder as well, it makes you question this idea of a peaceful Christian takeover in Ireland. I think paganism lasted a lot longer, and that's one of the themes in this book as well. But I think as well as it lasting a lot longer, I think it was put down, and we see this in the hagiographies which appear around 1000 AD here in Ireland anyway, where they're talking about Patrick and Bridget, and these are written hundreds of years after these people supposedly existed. I don't believe they were historical people anyway, but we get kind of anecdotes where Patrick is throwing druids off the mountain and he's drowning goddesses, and that was an interesting element for me, especially when you look at the idea of witchcraft in Ireland. And a lot of people say, well, isn't it great that we didn't have the witch burnings and the church didn't persecute women in that way? But as Dashu talks about, a lot of the time it wasn't the church who took on this, it was the church who certainly instigated the persecution, but they would hand these women over to landowners, to lords, and they would actually dispense with these people who were very often poor, so you shouldn't really expect to read about them. You know, like they weren't considered worthy enough to have something written about them. Here in Ireland, of course, so many records have been destroyed, so many buildings holding records through the various wars we've had, all the way from like the 16th century on. So if people are looking for an extant record of witch persecution in Ireland, you're not going to find it. It's even if it was there, it's gone now. But we do have strange and very dark folklore regarding drowning holes, where women who were considered fairy doctors or witches were brought and they were drowned by the landowners. So that's something different, and perhaps there's something more to be uncovered there. I certainly think there is anyway. So when people say we didn't have the witch persecution in Ireland that we had in mainland Europe, I don't believe that that's actually true. I just think that the records of it are gone. Traditionally, in Catholic countries, witches fare better, but don't forget, like, Ireland's Catholics were persecuted by the Normans anyway. So this idea that we had an ongoing Catholic kind of belief system which tolerated the witches in some kind of folk medicine sense is just not true. It didn't happen. Now, what I want to also say about that is, we'll bring up something that Dashu talks about, which is the Sheila and the Gig. And for a long time that was also considered something that the Normans brought into Ireland, and they would supposedly place carvings or slabs with carvings on them into church walls, which were supposed to represent the kind of vulgarity and the sinfulness of sexuality. But there's great evidence that Dashu talks about, which shows that this figure goes all the way back to, like in Serbia, 7000 BCE, the Foremother figure, as it's called. And also, of course, it kind of links very strongly in a visual sense to the toad and frog goddesses, which appear in world cultures, I think, as far as like Polynesia to Egypt and to Ireland as well. So even though this book is saying that it's women in European folk religion, Dashu goes a lot further than that, and she does talk about the kind of Neolithic symbolism and the motifs and how they kind of were the archetypes of a lot of the goddess and the female saints, which comes later on in the book as well. Certainly they kept certain pagan motifs. She talks about the swan feet of certain saints in France, for example, which was very interesting, and you might tie that in somehow to an Irish folk story called the Children of Lear. I won't go into it, but you can look that up. So just as we have this theme of spinning and weaving and the past, present and the future coming around in a cyclical way, you might be optimistic, well, and you might think, well, hopefully we are uncovering all of this past. Another book that I would recommend to go along with this is Maria Gimbutas and her work, The Living Goddess. And in fact, in the podcast that I will link to, Max Dashu talks about recent findings in genome and DNA evidence relating to Gimbutas' work, and how even her own critics are kind of saying perhaps she was right, and that has huge ramifications for Europe, obviously, but here in Ireland as well. I think it's very interesting. One figure that comes up in the book quite a lot is the Calic, and it's one that I write about myself quite a bit. I think she kind of is someone who turns up as kind of the winter goddess in all of European cultures, and the kind of the transfer of her attributes to the women accused of witches is very interesting to look at as well. In fact, I have this little guide. It's not the night battles, it's a guide to the night battles, and I would recommend it. It kind of looks at the kind of way things were in Italy in the 16th century, and perhaps it's something that would kind of what would I say? It will help people reading this book, because this book really is it's a fantastic book to just read, but it's also an amazing reference book, and you can open up any page and then you can go off online if you want and research and find further information, I suppose. And I find that that's why it's taken me so long to review it, because like I'm still going through it and I'm going back to it over and over again. In a way, it's a much more in-depth version of this book here, which is The Woman in the Shaman's Body by Barbara Tedlock. Dashu's work, I think, is something that's going to really revise our historical understanding of shamanism, of the idea of the sorceress, the prophetess, and hopefully it will be something that really revises how we look at our own indigenous Irish spirituality. So I kind of have focused mostly on Ireland in this review, and I suppose it's the only way I can really approach it, unless I was going to do like a 16 kind of part review myself, which is what kind of, it's the only way that you could really do justice to the book. So if you're going to order it, I would recommend ordering the book from Valida Press instead of Amazon, and I think it's a foundational book for anyone interested in witchcraft, in shamanism, and in European indigenous spirituality. So it's Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, 700 to 1100 by Max Dashu, and it's highly, highly recommended.